to the first Journalism Conversation series of the year. This is a production led and produced by students. We are all affected by the things we hear in the news. But there are certain things that stand out more than others, and which receive far more attention than others. We could go as far as the Salem witch trials to talk about how the media can cause hysteria in the public. But the actual definition of moral panic go back to when Stanley Cohen started to notice how badly mobs and rockers were being represented in the press. Today, we read and see images and headlines that stand out: knife crime in London, hate crime against Muslims, and anti-Semitism in the Labour Party. The press has a duty to inform, not to misrepresent or distort. And so our debate begins. We welcome our professor Yasmin Alibhai-Brown, who writes for various newspaper outlets and was a columnist of the year in 2017. Rabbi who is based at the Progressive Synagogue in Finchley. James Patrick, who is prolific journalist and author of provocative titles like Chemical Sausage. And Jonathan Hewitt, who is a CEO of one of the post-legal press regulators Impress, and an advocate for freedom of expression. The chair is shared by our own Professor Kurt Barling and Martine Skaret, who is a third-year creative writing and journalism student. The discussion will last around 40 minutes, and then there will be chance for Q&A.
Arek, thank you very much. Welcome everyone. Good to see almost a full house. That's pretty good. It's great to have this fantastic spread of guests, to have intelligent conversation, as we like to talk about at a university. And we're going to talk briefly about three subjects of which we're all familiar. The rise of hate crime, the impact of platform journalism, and big data or algorithms, if you're particularly technical, on spreading news more quickly and the impact that has on the rising temperature of public discourse. I'm not going to say the word Trump too often, but I'll say it here. That's what we're talking about, the impact of a rising heat of social media discourse on what we might describe as moral panic, and how the press is regulated, how we deal with that. How do we deal with this rising temperature? Leveson told us we weren't doing things quite right in British journalism, and British journalists are ever more aware since then of the ethical tightrope. Of course, you're all aware of the ethical tightrope because you're talking about it in sessions all the time. So, my co-chair, or I should say I'm the co-chair, Martine is the real chair here, will take over from me now and get this conversation going. Martine.
First we'll be talking a bit about hate crime, and you could say that the most notable hate crime, the most notable moral panic is the way Muslims are represented in the press. We have headlines such as The Sun saying that 1 in 5 Muslims sympathize with jihadis. And Yasmin, you are a journalist, a Muslim yourself. Do you think that this press coverage is symptomatic for moral panic, or is it just about journalism?
Well, it's a good question. It's a whole lot of things. There has to be fair and accurate reporting of everyone, minorities and majorities. And and I am a Muslim, and I would be the last person to say that everything you see in the press is part of a hate campaign against Muslims or a moral panic. There are some genuine stories which must be covered, and must be covered without fear or favour. And I would include in that the actual important, quite scary radicalization of some young Muslims, but the radicalization of hard right white children as well. There is a problem with certain kinds of group rape. So I think there is a straightforward journalism which has to happen and which is happening, and that's fine. Where I think it absolutely tips over into not only moral panic but moral fear-mongering is when every day, every hour, you get sometimes quite fake Muslim stories on the front page of the Times newspaper. On the Times, one of our most respected papers, they had a completely made-up story about a child who had been adopted by a so-called Muslim family, fostered, and had been forced to become Muslim. And this was wrong. So, and there's a very good chap called Miqdad Versi, who's become a one-man band, who holds these papers to account. And he gets I think he's got the Daily Mail to apologize 7 times. So I think there's a difference between the two. We need the first, but we really should be very critical of what's happening with the second.
Rabbi Rebecca, can I bring you in here? Because of course, the Jewish community has long suffered from misrepresentation, being misunderstood. And then you get a story like the anti-Semitism in the Labour Party, and it all of a sudden seems in the press to be a problem not for the Labour Party, but a problem for the Jewish community. And that is a kind of, it seems odd. Of course you're dealing with members of your community all the time. How do they see that kind of coverage? Does it accentuate the anxiety, if you like, that they have about the way in which others see them?
So I think there's huge anxiety at the moment in the Jewish community about the Labour Party, about seeing this constant. I'm super aware, I'm a rabbi of a local congregation, and I teach children a great deal. And it does feel unprecedented, certainly in my lifetime, that the word anti-Semitism should occupy the front page of the press. I think it's really interesting who is the maker of the stories. I was very struck when Billy Bragg, someone that I grew up to his music, made a comment that implied the Jewish community needed to do work to reconnect themselves with the Labour Party. So when people who occupy great media position speak in a way that creates an insensitivity that does immense damage, that's when I sit up and take note. I am well aware in my community, as in the wider community, that much gets exaggerated. I am aware of the hate crimes within the Jewish community. I'm aware that 2017 was the highest year. We're not sure yet this year. I am aware of all of that, and yet I always call for caution within the Jewish community. I know that the call for being moderate sometimes feels a little dull, but I think it's imperative that we, within the Jewish community, hold on to that sense of ourselves not purely as victims. Hold on to ourselves to do radical things that when we feel under siege, we turn and we make our job even stronger to look out for Islamophobia, that we see ourselves partnered with other ethnic minorities. I think it is an ongoing challenge, this holding the anxiety and not allowing it to be infectious and grow and light more fires and yet be taken seriously. And I think there lies the challenge for us.
So like Yasmin, there's a feeling that the temperature is rising, and the agent of the temperature rising is the coverage that we see in our national, regional media.
I think so, but I sometimes think victims and perpetrators, or however you like to call us, sometimes get caught up with the narrative about ourselves. So I would say it is not purely the press.
Okay, well that's music to Jonathan's ears, of course. He's the one who's kick back and drink my cappuccino and don't worry about it. But seriously, Jonathan.
I haven't got a cappuccino.
Oh, sorry.
I'm
so sorry. Well, I have a glass of water then. So here we are, Jonathan. It's a problem. The temperature is rising. It's not always the fault of the media, but quite often it can be. And you are one of the two regulators of the media, print media, and ultimately it's your job to be a bit of an arbitrator, isn't it?
Thanks
when
for
these things.
I don't even get a cappuccino.
Well, you get a cappuccino after.
Okay, all right. So moral panics. I just want to begin by slightly sort of stirring up this idea of moral panic. And we live in what I'm very glad is a very morally open society. There is no single moral code that dominates British life, and to me that is a hallmark of what makes this an open, plural societies, if you say we broadly fall into two camps, in fact we probably fall into 70 million camps, but let's say there's broadly a sort of liberal moral code which is about tolerance, mutual respect, personal autonomy, and there's a more conservative code which says, look, tradition is important, you do things the way they've been done because that works and it gives people a sense of belonging and security. Personally, I'm very much in the liberal camp, but I don't have an absolute conviction that I'm absolutely right. You know, I am open to the idea that I may be wrong about some of those issues, or the way that they work out may need a bit more negotiation. Like, you know, one of my great mantras is always what William Blake said, that the man who never alters his opinion is like standing water and breeds reptiles of the mind. So, you know, I'm open to changing my mind. So for that reason, we need a society where you can have quite vigorous moral debate. Just as the media hosts political debate, right, left, centre, all aspects on the spectrum, I do believe you need to have a media that can host moral debate as well. And the flip side to what we're calling moral panic is something you might call moral celebration or moral praise. So look at the way that homosexuality was represented when I was growing up in the 70s. Terribly negative. Homosexuality was at worst a sin, at best a joke, and for most people somewhere in between. Over the period since then, the media, parts of the media, have played a really important positive role. I'm thinking of places like the BBC and certain newspapers in actually promoting a much more celebratory image of homosexuality and enabling people to lead out lives without being the subject of ridicule or hostility. So I think the point I want to make in general is let's be careful about babies in bathwater here. If you just say we don't like that morality and we want to regulate it, I think there's a danger that you actually potentially inhibit moral debate. As a regulator, what we can do is we can look at accuracy. So the Times foster care story was riddled, as Yasmin says, with inaccuracies. That's one way of getting at the problem. As a regulator, we can look at discrimination, so a story that discriminates against an individual. As if you remember, a few years ago, there was someone called Lucy Meadows. Lucy Meadows had been a man called Nathan Upton and transitioned into the identity of a woman, was a school teacher in Lancashire and was the subject of vicious media attacks by Richard Littlejohn, saying this was a disgrace, this man-woman, in his view, should not be allowed to teach children because it's going to cause them lifelong harm and trauma. That's discrimination against an individual. We could deal with that kind of issue, and it impressed me that we strengthened our code to make sure that we also cover groups as well as individuals. So similar attacks on the transgender community, we would also pick up. So there's ways we would get at manifestations of moral panic, but I wouldn't want to say let's regulate moral panic as such, because I'm not quite sure where moral panic stops and moral debate begins.
That's an important distinction, isn't it? That actually you're there not to wield a big stick, but to try and ensure that people engage in constructive engagement with the issues, but not to get people to ignore the issues.
And try, as a regulator, to not take sides is incredibly important as well.
Yeah, that's a really important topic, actually. But also to bring it slightly back to hate crime, because as you mentioned, we don't really know how, you said it was really bad in 2017, now we're in 2018, and actually last month we saw headlines of the Home Office report saying that hate crimes towards religious groups have risen to 40% in England and Wales. And James, you're a former police officer and now you investigate as a journalist. How do you think the media, or do you think the media distorts hate crimes in the news, and what do you think the effects are of that?
I think one of the important things that people need to understand is that there's been a significant shift in the way that the media delivers over the last couple of years, and everything is driven by online. So actually our social media content becomes the news, so the more rage is on social media, the more rage there is reflected in the actual news. The reason I got into this was almost an accident, really. In 2017, I was having an argument with a neo-Nazi on Twitter, and it was following it was following Trump's comments about last night in Sweden, and there were all kinds of allegations about the migrant crisis and and crimes by migrants and neighbourhoods on fire. And I simply went to go and check. I take an objective view, I don't take the political stance, and I was a cop for 10 years, and basically you have your opinion battered out of you, and it's just straightforward, what's the evidence, what does it say? So I went and I took a look, and it was important really, because I came away with a very different picture of what truth is in Sweden, and a very different picture of how that new media is distorting people's perceptions, which sort of leads into the next segment of this. In terms of, is hate crime distorted in the media? It is, within this new format, and part of that has been over the last few years, the mainstream outlets like the Telegraph and the Times have retreated behind paywalls. And what that's done is it's taken a lot of regulated news out of circulation for a lot of people on the internet, and it's created this vacuum in which these alternative outlets have grown. So what you now get is distorted sort of stories which are coming from people who do have an agenda, and actually that's then becoming part of our conscious and part of conversations. And then you take new platforms who've stepped into the mainstream like BuzzFeed, and actually they're taking their entire lead from social media. Their entire model is based around what's viral on social media. So if you can have somebody spreading a hostile narrative on social media, and it's very, very structured, and it's very, very controlled, and it's exactly what Trump does, and exactly what the alt-right do, and exactly what other groups do, it then becomes the news, and actually reshapes the way that news is delivered. So hate crime becomes almost normal. And I looked at structures around some representations of alt-right figures that have now become almost famous in the media. And the way that they were dealt with was that they were treated as celebrities. And it just became more and more normal. And what you can actually see was the sort of the shift in the Overton window from something that we should have been absolutely horrified about to something which is perfectly normal and actually celebrated, where these people are going around and doing tours and we're talking about them. But that entire perception is completely false, because if you turn up to these events, it's not a broadly reflective thing. They don't have thousands and thousands of people. It's just acted to legitimise this sort of outpouring of hate. And as we've gone on, that's become more and more overt, and it's become part of our daily conversation that people are reporting inappropriately on events and courts purely to drive divisive narratives. And you see it in the anti-Semitism debates within Labour, and you see it within the anti-Muslim stuff, and you see it within this sort of focus on paedophile rings and these horrific comments which come out almost constantly from people like Katie Hopkins. And you talk about moral panic, and I'm looking at it, and I'm looking at weaponised data and weaponised information.
And I wondered, because here in North London, and lots of parts of London, over the past 5 or so years, it's obvious that the Jewish community feels increasingly vulnerable. There's security on synagogues, there's security on schools, there's security on primary. No other community goes down that route. And I wonder if
I think the
that
Muslim
is
community is having
starting to think about it now. Yeah. Is it this conversation, this heightened conversation, which is driving that? Do you think, or is it both of what you're talking about, a bit of victim, and we have to be careful we don't take this too much to heart?
Yeah, I think it's a kind of reciprocating anxiety that grows up in the community. For as long as I have been alive in this country, I think Jewish communities have felt the need to protect themselves. And that's from data, not just from this country, but outside the country. But I do recognise this terrible, bitter irony that the more there is protection outside Jewish schools or synagogues, the more the notion of this fortress of protection creates an antagonism with the rest of the community. I am very aware, my synagogue was really late to the party, to the extent that I think many in the Jewish community were quite disdainful of our refusing of paid security, and we had this very friendly rota of members of the synagogue that were welcomers as opposed to security, and clearly it had no training. My son, most of all, just as a way to get out of being in the service, stood at the gate. See, that's his favourite activity. But now I think we're under encouragement from the rest of the community. We recognise that we need to kind of act in accordance. So there is no doubt there is a threat. and we are well aware of copycat attacks. I have watched with interest and grief the last week after the attack in a synagogue in Pittsburgh, fully aware that that was not the first attack on a place of worship in the States, and therefore there is nothing different about us as a group of Jews, as whether it's a high school or a church. But of course it reverberates, and I noticed that, and Sajid Javid and Sadiq Khan joined the Jewish community last week to talk about the increased or amplified threat, which the community, which the press responded to with courtesy, sensitivity, but I am aware, and I probably speak out of turn. I think I have many colleagues that would speak in a much more modest way about us taking responsibility for ourselves. There is a problem. We are living in uncomfortable times, but I do not think that we jettison our responsibility to reach out and be active in the community, be concerned about other hate crimes, be concerned about other communities. Our synagogue, if I can just carry on, because we have a deep connection with you at Middlesex University, because 3 years ago, our synagogue led the campaign to persuade Barnet Council to accept 50 Syrian refugees under the VPRS, Vulnerable Person Relocation Scheme. And we were delighted, we succeeded. Your fantastic Vice-Chancellor came along, promised perhaps free tuition, and indeed Andrea, your Vice-Chancellor, has been able to fulfill that. So we are really involved in 50 people's lives, now 56 because of babies having been born here, and you have stepped up and are helping us support them. I am sure that we are under siege for doing that in some pockets of the Jewish community, but I also know the press has not been as responsive to this good news story as it could have been. And so papers sell much more when it talks about the beleaguered Jewish communities behind their reams of security than it does when actually we feel ourselves strong to reach out and to do as much as we can for refugee communities. And we know that the attacker in Pittsburgh, particularly although he declared himself an anti-Semite, his social media entries the day before were about the work that this community was doing for refugees.
Can I want to just add...
Martine pick up, because we need to move it on into this.
I just want to make one very quick point, because one of the problems with the coverage of all of the anti-Semitism was it was so politicized. There's a lot of substantial evidence, kind of objective evidence, which shows that anti-Semitism on the right, especially in the Conservative Party, numerically is much greater, but because certain sections of the I think the Jewish content in particular, was kind of targeting the Labour Party. Quite a lot of like today we had this story about Roger Scruton, don't we, who was given a top job, public service job, and he has muttered something about George Soros and the Jews taking over Hungary. So it would have been good if the media had equally covered anti-Semitism across the spectrum, but they didn't do that.
And James, perhaps when he talked about weaponizing and the tendency to weaponize discourse is an example of that, Martine.
Yeah, well, we talked about how the media is kind of, even listening to what we write on social media, and becoming more populist and spreading we have so different between us now, and we as people that consume media and are on social media, we have a responsibility. Yasmin, do you have an idea of how we can escape the echo chamber of Twitter, of social media, and not let ourselves be brainwashed by exactly what we see and the algorithms making what we see?
No, and I think as somebody who's
That's depressing.
I know, just no.
That's so depressing.
No, because even as a journalist and actually quite a powerful person in the media world, I've had a week of such really atrocious bullying and disabling commentary coming through social media that I wrote in today's column, I went into a place where nobody could see or hear me and howled, because how is it possible that I tweeted something completely fair, which was when the Leicester City Football Club manager died, and I was so moved by the mourners who came from every background. It didn't matter who they were. They mourned this man who had brought the city together. It's one of the most diverse cities in this country. And I said in the tweet, so what does Mrs. May, an intellectual nativist such as, I didn't name them, but David Goodhart, for example, have to say about what they refer to migrants or people like me as people of nowhere, right? For that, I now have gone to the police. I don't know what to do. Even I don't know what to do except to sit and cry.
That's an interesting point. You can cry on my shoulder.
Oh.
Jonathan, one of the points about the regulator is that people have a place to go when they have such a grievance. It's not just having to go to the police, it's actually because the police aren't going to necessarily challenge the people who are perpetrating this, but it's where you can, holding these people to account. That's part of your role, is it not?
It is, yeah. But I mean, you asked what can we do about Twitter. I mean, one thing we can do is come off it, as I did a couple of years ago. Not only because I hated the abuse that I got and that I witnessed, but also because I found myself getting down a bit closer to that level because of the nature of the social media economy and having to distill your complicated, nuanced thoughts into,
280 characters.
And it kind of reminded me of something. I mean, Yasmin and I, years ago, were involved in a campaign around the Religious Hatred Act, which we were concerned was actually going to go too far to limiting religious debate. And Monica Ali was a novelist who was involved in that campaign as well. She'd written a novel called Brick Lane about the Bengali community in Tower Hamlets. And a tiny group of male Muslim elders had got together with the TV cameras around them and burnt a copy of the book. And then everyone came to Monica and other writers and intellectuals, isn't this terrible? Oh, it's terrible. And then they go back to the Muslim elders, what do you think about these writers and intellectuals? Oh, we think they're terrible. And Monica actually stepped aside from that and described it. This is pre-social media as the economy of outrage, where old media is thriving on. There's always a story as long as someone's pissed off somewhere. And social media has just taken that to the end. The rate of it's like a machine where the ball is just pinging around at a kind of extraordinary speed of outrage. And I've taken myself out of it. I'm not sure if the answer is for everyone to take themselves out of it. I mean, we talked yesterday, I don't want to go into all the technical details, there are challenges around regulating social media, but it's not impossible. I think there is a growing consensus at the moment there is too much of a legal vacuum around both the responsibility of individual users and the responsibility of the platforms. And too much has been got away with for too long. And I think there's a mood now that has got to change. So we talked about the Overton window, which moves around when something, 5 years ago everyone said you can't regulate the internet. It's like Canute trying to turn back the tide. That window has moved. There is a sense now that we can and should, but we haven't yet got to the point of how. So I think there is change afoot.